Power isn't measured by how many people fear your name, but by who stands beside you when you can no longer whisper it. The Sky Lounge wasn't just a restaurant, it was a high-altitude theater of ego. Beneath the city's constellations, the air smelled of expensive sandalwood and the sharp iron scent of unspoken threats. Bak Tae-gun sat at the center of it all, his open collar suit revealing the ink on his chest, a dragon that had once commanded the streets of Seoul. To the headlines, he was the restructuring king, a man of cold logic. To the underworld, he was a ghost with a blade. Tonight, he was enjoying the view of a city he thought he owned, unaware that his own blood was turning into lead. Nam So-min moved through the shadows of the dining room with a terrifying quietness. She wasn't the kind of waitress who flirted for tips or hurried for praise. She moved with a rhythmic, grounded weight, her eyes never resting on the faces of the elite, but on their hands. While the other staff saw a generous benefactor in Tae-gun's second-in-command, So-min saw the way the man's knuckles whitened when Tae-gun took a sip of his wine. She saw the exact moment the light in Tae-gun's eyes began to flicker. Most would have looked away, most would have run, but So-min didn't have the luxury of being like most people. Beneath her starch white uniform was a body mapped with the scars of a life she'd tried to bury. As the red wine spilled across the white linen, a crimson clock taking down his final seconds, So-min didn't drop her tray in shock. She gripped it like a shield. She didn't see a dying boss. She saw a man who was about to be executed in his own home. And for the first time in 3 years, the ghost inside her woke up. Bak Tae-gun had spent his entire life mastering the art of the stare, a cold, unblinking gaze that could make grown men tremble. But as he looked out over the sprawling tapestry of Seoul's neon lights from his penthouse booth, the city began to blur. It wasn't the wine, a vintage Petrus that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. It was the way the air seemed to be thickening, turning into a heavy, invisible syrup in his lungs. He tried to adjust his cufflink, but his fingers felt like distant strangers, clumsy and numb. To anyone else in the Sky Lounge, he looked like a king in repose, the tiger surveying his territory with a relaxed, open-collar elegance. But Nam So-min, standing at the edge of the amber light with a silver carafe in hand, saw the truth. She didn't see a god. She saw the physiological signature of Akhenaten, the queen of poisons. She watched the minute twitch in his jaw and the way his pupils pinned into tiny black needles. Nam So-min's heartbeat remained a steady, low thrum, a relic of a past life where panic was a death sentence. She scanned the room, not as a waitress looking for a tip, but as a predator identifying a trap. She saw him, Lee Jung-gi, Tae-gun's second-in-command, sitting 3 tables away. He was laughing too loudly at a joke that wasn't funny, his eyes darting toward Tae-gun's table with the frantic hunger of a man who had already started measuring the throne for himself. The betrayal was silent, draped in silk and fine dining. Tae-gun reached for the glass again, his instinct for control fighting the creeping paralysis. He was a man who believed he could dictate the terms of his own death, but as he leaned forward, the world tilted. He looked up, his gaze finally colliding with So-min's. For 3 years, he had treated her like furniture, a ghost in a white apron. Now, in the fog of his fading consciousness, he saw the sharpness in her eyes, a lethal, focused intelligence that didn't belong in a restaurant. She didn't look away. She stepped closer, the soft rustle of her uniform the only sound in his narrowing world. "Don't fight the breath, Mr. Bak," she whispered, her voice a calm anchor in the rising tide of his terror. As the first drop of red wine escaped his nerveless grip and began its slow descent toward the white linen, So-min felt the familiar weight of the world shifting. The killer was in the room, the poison was in the blood, and the king was falling. But as she reached out to steady the glass, her grip was like iron. The invisible waitress was gone. The soldier had returned. The crystal glass didn't just slip. It shattered against the marble floor with a sound that felt like the final gavel of a judge. To the other diners, it was an embarrassing accident, but to Bak Tae-gun, it was the sound of his world collapsing. The vintage red wine didn't splash. It bled across the white linen, a dark, jagged map of his own failure. He tried to rise, his pride screaming at him to stand, but his muscles were no longer his own. They had turned to lead, then to ice, as the toxin completed its takeover. He was a statue of a king, frozen in a throne of velvet and shadow. The coldness that swept through the room wasn't just the air conditioning, it was the sudden, surgical withdrawal of his protection. His loyal bodyguards, men he had fed, clothed, and paid in blood for a decade, didn't rush to his side. Instead, they stepped back in a synchronized choreography of betrayal. They didn't look at him. They looked at Lee Jung-gi, who had stopped laughing and was now watching Tae-gun with the clinical curiosity of a man watching an insect drown in oil. The silence was absolute, a vacuum where his authority used to be. From the periphery of the kitchen entrance, the first assassin moved. He wasn't a man of words. He was a shadow in a charcoal suit, sliding a ceramic blade from his sleeve that wouldn't trip a metal detector. He moved with the confidence of someone killing a ghost. Tae-gun watched the blade descend, his mind screaming for his hand to move, for his heart to beat, for the world to make sense. Then, the light changed. A silver serving tray caught the amber glow of the chandelier, spinning through the air like a localized sun. It didn't just hit the assassin's wrist, it collided with the bone with a crack that echoed like a gunshot through the vaulted ceiling. The blade skittered away, ringing against the floor. Before the sound could even fade, Nam So-min was there. She didn't move like a waitress anymore. The performative tilt of her head was gone, replaced by a terrifying centered gravity. She stepped over the shattered glass, her shoes crunching on the remnants of Tae-gun's dinner, and positioned herself directly between the paralyzed boss and the world that wanted him dead. She didn't reach for a gun. She reached for the heavy, weighted carafe on the table, her grip sure and lethal. The assassins hesitated, momentarily blinded by the sheer impossibility of the sight. A girl they had ignored for years, standing as the last line of defense for the tiger of Buso-san. She didn't look back at Tae-gun, but he could feel the heat radiating from her, the fierce, protective energy of a guardian who had finally stopped hiding. In the reflection of the wine-soaked marble, he saw her face, calm, lethal, and entirely human. She wasn't saving a boss, she was reclaiming herself. "Don't speak, just breathe," So-min commanded. Her voice was no longer the soft, rehearsed lilt of a service professional. It was a low, vibrating frequency that cut through the ringing in Tae-gun's ears. He felt her hand press briefly against the center of his chest, a grounding weight that seemed to keep his soul from drifting out of his paralyzed frame. For 3 years, Baek Tae-gun had lived in the presence of this woman, seeing only the white of her apron and the steady hands that filled his water. He had ordered the deaths of dozens with a casual flick of his wrist, believing himself a master of human nature. Yet he realized now he had been blind. He was looking up at her from the floor, his head resting against the base of the velvet booth, and for the first time, he actually saw her. He saw the cold, tactical fire in her eyes and the way her body coiled like a high-tension wire. The second assassin lunged, his movement a blur of lethal intent. So-min didn't flinch. She used the very tools of the life she had been hiding in to dismantle the threat. With a flick of her wrist, a heavy linen napkin snapped out like a whip, catching the man's throat and jerking his momentum off balance. In the same breath, she caught a falling steak knife by the handle, the steel glinting once before she drove it through the attacker's foot, pinning him to the floor with a gruesome thud. She was a whirlwind of fluid, terrifying grace. She moved through the chaos like a dancer who knew the music of violence better than anyone in the room. When a third man reached for a firearm, So-min shattered a wine carafe against the edge of the table and used the jagged glass as an extension of her own hand. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion, only the brutal efficiency of someone who had been forged in a fire far hotter than the streets of Seoul. "The freight elevator, now," she muttered, though she was talking more to herself than the man who couldn't move. She hooked her arms under Tae-gun's shoulders, hauling his dead weight with a strength that defied her slender frame. The betrayal of his guards had left a vacuum, but Somin filled it with a wall of steel. As she dragged him toward the back of the house, she kicked a heavy prep table into the path of the remaining pursuers, the screech of metal on marble sounding like a war cry. Taegon watched the ceiling lights flash past, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was the tiger, the man built on fear, yet he was being carried to safety by a ghost. As the industrial doors of the service elevator hissed open, Somin shoved him inside and slammed the manual override. In the flickering fluorescent light of the metal box, she finally looked down at him. The debt of the dead had been called in, and the price was a secret she could no longer keep. The descent into the city's concrete veins was a blur of fluorescent flickers and the hum of the elevator's steel cables. By the time they reached the hidden basement of a nondescript suburban dry cleaner, the high-altitude glamour of the Sky Lounge felt like a fever dream. The air here was thick with the scent of industrial detergent and damp earth, a stark contrast to the sandalwood that had defined Taegon's evening. Somin dropped him onto a rusted medical cot with a grunt of exertion. She didn't offer him a pillow or a word of comfort. Instead, she moved with a rhythmic, frighteningly efficient purpose, tearing open a first aid kit that looked like it had been stolen from a combat unit. Taegon watched her through the haze of his failing vision, his body still a heavy, useless cage. He was the man who held the keys to the city's gates, yet here he lay, staring at the peeling gray paint of a ceiling that smelled of failure. He watched her hands. They were no longer the hands that gently offered menus. They were the hands of an architect of survival. She moved between him and a makeshift workstation, crushing charcoal tablets and mixing a solution with the precision of an apothecary. As she leaned over him to administer the charcoal slurry and a stimulant to keep his heart from fluttering into a final stop, the harsh overhead bulb caught the line of her jaw. In the silence of the basement, Taegon finally understood. Her composed nature at the restaurant wasn't a lack of personality or the submissiveness of a service worker. It was a mask, the same kind of mask he wore, but forged in a different fire. He saw the way she didn't flinch at the sound of a car backfiring in the alley above. He saw the scars on her forearms, half hidden by her rolled-up sleeves, white, jagged lines that told stories of blades and close-quarters desperation. She hadn't just seen war. She was a veteran of a shadow world that made his Mafia skirmishes look like schoolyard brawls. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had inverted. Taegon, the tiger, was now the ward, a helpless witness to his own salvation. He wanted to demand answers, to reassert the authority that had been his birthright. But as she wiped the cold sweat from his forehead with a rough towel, her gaze met his. There was no fear in her eyes, no deference, only a grim, clinical empathy. "The poison is stubborn, but your heart is more stubborn. Rest. The man you called brother thinks you're dead. For now, that's the only thing keeping you alive." He closed his eyes, surrendering to the darkness, realizing that the woman he had ignored for 3 years was the only person in the world who truly saw him. He wasn't a boss to her. He was on a mission. And for a man who had spent his life surrounded by people who only loved his shadow, the weight of her care was the most terrifying thing he had ever felt. The vibration of the phone on the metal nightstand sounded like a death knell in the cramped basement. Taegon reached for it, his movements still sluggish, the poison lingering in his joints like rusted gears. The screen glowed with a news alert that felt like a punch to the gut. Breaking, business mogul Baek Tae-gun dies of sudden cardiac arrest. Beneath the headline was a photograph of Lee Jung-gi standing on the steps of their corporate headquarters, a black armband visible on his suit, his face a masterpiece of manufactured grief. He wasn't just mourning, he was already holding the keys. Reports followed of an emergency board meeting where Jung-gi had been unanimously voted as the interim successor to maintain stability. Tae-gun stared at the screen, a low, guttural growl vibrating in his chest. The poison had nearly stopped his heart, but this, the sight of his brother wearing his mantle before his body was even cold, burned worse. He tried to surge upward, a snarl twisting his features. "I'll kill him," he rasped, his voice a jagged edge of its former self. "I'll burn that office to the ground with him inside it. He thinks he can steal a decade of my blood?" So-men didn't look up from the small stove where she was heating a tin of broth. "Sit down, Tae-gun. You can barely hold a phone, let alone a grudge." "He betrayed the family," Tae-gun spat, the dragon on his chest appearing to writhe as his muscles tensed. "He betrayed me." "The family?" So-men finally turned, her gaze flat and unyielding. She walked over and took the phone from his shaking hand, turning the screen off. "Look at those reports again. Your captains didn't revolt, your soldiers didn't riot. They fell in line within the hour. Do you know why?" Tae-gun glared at her, but she didn't flinch. "Because your empire was built on a foundation of sand. You built a world on fear and a paycheck. Fear is a temporary currency, and a paycheck can be signed by anyone. You think Joongi is the architect of your ruin, but he's just the one who noticed the cracks first." Tae-gun opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. He looked around the damp, gray basement, at the woman who had saved him for no profit, and the cheap cot that was now his only kingdom. For years, he thought he was the architect, the master builder of a legacy, but as the silence of the basement settled over him, he realized the truth in her cold eyes. He hadn't built a fortress, he had built a gilded cage, and the bars had finally shifted. He didn't just need revenge. For the first time in his life, he needed to learn how to actually survive. The dim light of the basement cast long, jagged shadows against the concrete, and in that silence, the air between them felt heavier than the city pressing down from above. Tae-gun watched So-min as she checked the perimeter monitors, small, flickering screens he hadn't noticed before. Her handling of the technology with a terrifying familiarity, her movements devoid of any hesitation. "You aren't just a waitress who knows first aid," Tae-gun said, his voice regaining his gravelly resonance. "The way you moved in that restaurant, that wasn't self-defense, that was a harvest." So-min didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on a graining feed of the alleyway. "In my previous life, I didn't exist," she began, her voice flat and devoid of nostalgia. "I was a phantom project, state-trained, scrubbed from every birth record and census. I was a scalpel meant for the hearts of people exactly like you." She finally turned, her gaze level and piercing. "7 years ago, I burned my fingerprints and watched my own funeral from a distance. I chose that restaurant because it was supposed to be a tomb for my past, a place to be invisible." Tae-gun let out a harsh, dry laugh. "And yet you threw it all away for a man who didn't even know your name? Why? By saving me, you've alerted every sensor from Seoul to Langley. You're back on the grid now. They'll come for you as surely as they're coming for me." So-min stepped closer, the clinical coldness in her eyes flickering with something raw and deeply human. "I spent a decade being told that some lives are worth more than others, that killing for a flag or a fortune makes a monster a hero. But as I watched you choking on that wine, I didn't see a tiger or a billionaire. I saw a man being disposed of like trash by people who called him a brother." She leaned down, her face inches from his, the scent of antiseptic and gunpowder clinging to her. "I didn't save you because you're a boss, Tae-gun. I don't care about your throne or your ink. I saved you because I'm tired of watching people die for nothing. I'm tired of the silence that follows a betrayal. If I'm going back on the grid, I'm doing it on my own terms, and I'm doing it to stop the cycle." The realization hit Tae-gun with more force than the toxin could ever. He had spent his life surrounded by mercenaries who valued his power. He was now being protected by a woman who despised his world but valued his life. For the first time, he wasn't looking at an asset or an enemy. He was looking at his only hope for a truth that didn't end in a shallow grave. They didn't dismantle the new regime with a declaration of war. They used a scalpel, cutting through the nerves of the organization until the body began to twitch in paranoia. Tae-gun, still pale, but with eyes that regained their predatory glint, operated from the shadows of the basement. He didn't reach for his gun. He reached for the secrets he had archived for a decade. With a series of encrypted pings and untraceable leaks, he began to whisper into the ears of his former captains. He planted seeds of doubt about Jung-gi's accidental takeover, hinting that the new boss was already planning to purge the old guard to cover his tracks. While Taegan fractured the mind of the empire, Somin became its physical ghost. She moved through the city like a draft of cold air, infiltrating the safe houses that Jung-gi hadn't yet secured. She didn't leave bodies behind, she left vacuums. In one night, she reclaimed the ledger of offshore accounts from a high-rise in Gandam and secured a cache of emergency hardware from a shipping container in Incheon. They were a symphony of brains and brawn, a harmony of two people who had spent their lives being instruments of destruction, now finally playing their own tune. Between the missions, the silence in the basement changed. It was no longer the heavy, suspicious quiet of a hostage and his captor. It became the shared breath of two survivors. One evening, as Somin stitched a graze on her shoulder, a gift from a close call at a warehouse, Taegun reached out. His hand hovered, hesitant before he took the needle from her. "I've spent my life buying people," he said softly, his voice echoing against the concrete walls as he worked with a surprisingly steady hand. "I never knew what it felt like to have someone simply show up." Somin didn't flinch as the thread pulled through her skin. She looked at him, not as the tiger of Busan, but as a man whose hands were finally being used to heal something rather than break it. "Trust is a dangerous thing to learn this late in the game, Taegun." "Maybe, but for the first time, I don't feel like I'm sitting at a table waiting for the poison." They were two people who had never been loved, who had been taught that vulnerability was the first step toward a grave. Yet as they mapped out the final strike against Jung-gi, the proximity was no longer just tactical, it was human. They were reclaiming his assets, but in the process, they were discovering something neither had ever owned, a reason to live that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with the person standing in the dark beside them. The return to the Sky Lounge felt like walking into a funeral where the corpse had refused to stay buried. The amber lights still glowed with that expensive artificial warmth, but the air was stale, heavy with the scent of a victory Lee Jung-gi hadn't earned. When the elevator doors hissed open, the room went silent. Taegun stepped out, the rhythmic thud-clack of his cane against the marble sounding like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. He looked diminished, his suit hung slightly loose on a frame thinned by the toxin, and his grip on the silver-headed cane was white-knuckled and trembling. He looked like a king who had come to beg for his life, a tiger with broken teeth. Jung-gi sat at the center table, the very spot where the wine had spilled nights before. He didn't rise. Instead, he leaned back, a glass of that same vintage Petrus in his hand, and laughed, a jagged, ugly sound that echoed off the floor-to-ceiling glass. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Taegun," Jung-gi mocked, his eyes bright with the triumph of a scavenger. "But you are a ghost. You should have stayed in whatever hole you crawled into. The poison clearly didn't finish the job, but I'm a man who believes in closure." He snapped his fingers, and 6 guards, Taegun's former shadows, stepped forward, unholstering their sidearms in a single fluid motion. The metal glinted under the chandeliers, a circle of executioners. Taegun stopped 10 feet away, leaning heavily on his cane, his breathing shallow. He looked up, not at Jung-gi, but at the dark, vaulted rafters hidden above the brilliant lights. "You talk about foundations, Jung-gi," Taegun rasped, a ghost of a smile touching his pale lips. "But you forgot that a house is only as strong as the people who keep it running." Jung-gi's face contorted. "Kill him, now." The guards squeezed their triggers. The room should have exploded with the thunder of gunfire and the spray of blood. Instead, a chorus of hollow, metallic clicks filled the air. 6 firing pins struck empty air or spent primers. The guards stared at their weapons in a sudden, frantic panic, pulling triggers again and again to the same useless rhythm. High above, hidden in the shadows of the ventilation ducts, Somin adjusted her position. She had spent the last 4 hours as a phantom in the ceiling, a silent ghost who had systematically replaced every magazine in the armory with expertly crafted blanks. She watched through the crosshairs of her own focus, not needing a rifle to be the most dangerous person in the room. Junggi's glass shattered on the floor, his face draining of color. He looked at his men, then back at the weak man with the cane. Taegun straightened his spine, the tremors in his hand vanishing as he let the cane fall. It clattered against the marble, no longer needed. The tiger wasn't broken. He had simply been waiting for the cage to open from the inside. In the silence of the failed execution, the only sound was the low, steady hum of the city outside, and the realization that the invisible staff had already decided who would leave this room alive. The silence that followed the hollow clicks of the empty guns was more deafening than any explosion. Junggi scrambled backward, his chair screeching against the marble like a dying animal. He looked at his guards, but they were no longer looking at him. They were looking at the doors, at the shadows, and finally at the man who had supposedly died. Taegun didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need one. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a small glass flash drive, placing it on the table where the poisoned wine had once pooled. "The empire you stole is already gone, Junggi," Taegun said, his voice low and steady. "While you were busy measuring the curtains in my office, every offshore account, every bribe to the precinct, and every shipping manifesto was being uploaded to the public prosecutor's server. You didn't just kill me, you made yourself the face of a dying organization." The monitors around the Sky Lounge, usually displaying stock market tickers and art, flickered and changed. They began to scroll through Junggi's private communications and the financial records of his coup. Below, in the street, the distant wail of sirens began to rise, a mechanical chorus coming for the man who thought he had won. Junggi lunged for the flash drive, but Taegun caught his wrist. The strength in the tiger's grip was back, a cold iron pressure that pinned the traitor in place. For a second, Junggi saw the old Taegun, the man who had built a fortune on fear. But as they locked eyes, the fury in Taegun's gaze faded into a profound, weary clarity. "I used to think this throne was a fortress. I thought I needed these walls, these guns, and this fear to be a king, but all it did was make me a target in a gilded cage." He let go of Junggi's arm and stepped back, turning his back on the man who had tried to murder him. It was the ultimate insult. Junggi was no longer worth the effort of a kill. The sirens were at the door now, blue and red lights dancing against the glass like restless spirits. Taegun looked up into the rafters, where he knew Somin was watching. He didn't need to see her to know she was already moving toward the exit, a ghost returning to the mist. He walked away from the table, away from the chair, and away from the blood-stained legacy of the tiger. He let the law take the traitor, and the streets take the remains of the empire. As he stepped into the cool night air of the balcony, Taegun realized he wasn't a king anymore, and for the first time in his life, he was finally powerful. He was no longer a beast behind bars. He was a man who had chosen to walk away from the cage entirely. The story of Taegun and Somin reminds us that the world we see, the one defined by titles, ink, and expensive suits, is often an illusion. We are taught to look up at the powerful, at the tigers who claim to own the city, while we walk past the quiet people in the background without a second glance. But as the wine spilled and the shadows moved, we saw the truth. True loyalty cannot be bought with fear, and the most formidable strength is often found in the person who refills your glass. Bae Taegun spent his life building a fortress of terror, only to find that it was a cage. He had to lose his voice, his throne, and his very ability to stand before he could see that a human connection is worth more than a decade of dominance. Nam So-min, a woman who had every reason to stay invisible, chose to step into the light, not for a paycheck or a master, but because she refused to let another soul be discarded as collateral damage. She taught him that grace isn't something you find in a temple. It can be found even in a poisoned cup, provided there is someone brave enough to catch you when you fall. This journey teaches us that our value isn't determined by the teeth we show the world, but by the hands we choose to hold when the lights go out. We are all capable of being the tiger, and we are all capable of being the waitress. The choice is whether we build empires of sand or foundations of trust. If you have ever felt invisible in a room full of people, or if you have felt the sting of a betrayal from someone you called brother, this story is for you. You are not defined by the mask you wear to survive, but by the heart that beats beneath it. Don't let the fire go out here. Subscribe and join our community of survivors, where we believe that every voice has weight and every story matters. Leave a comment below and share your own truth. Who was the waitress in your life? Who was the person you ignored, or the person who appeared out of nowhere to save you when you least expected it? We read every single story, because in a city of ghosts and masks, your voice is the only truth that truly matters. Join us and let's walk out of the cage together. Thank you for listening. See you in the next one.